Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
Sword Art Online is the kind of show people point to when they say great premise, terrible execution. The idea itself is fantastic. Thousands of players trapped inside a virtual reality MMO, where dying in the game means dying in real life. That setup practically writes tension, psychological drama, survival horror, social commentary, and strategic action on its own. Instead, the series somehow turns all that potential into one of the most frustratingly shallow experiences in mainstream anime. The biggest problem is that the show constantly refuses to engage with the implications of its own concept. Being trapped in a death game should feel terrifying. There should be paranoia, desperation, evolving social structures, moral compromises, and meaningful character growth. Instead, the series speedruns through major events like it's checking boxes on a plot outline. Entire floors are skipped, relationships appear out of nowhere, and supposedly life-changing experiences get brushed aside in favor of generic power fantasy nonsense. Then there's Kirito, who barely feels like a character at all. He's less of a person and more of a wish-fulfillment vending machine. He's instantly better than everyone else, effortlessly admired, emotionally unreadable, and somehow always the smartest guy in the room. The show wants him to come across as cool and mysterious, but most of the time he just feels bland and absurdly overpowered. The supporting cast doesn't fare much better. Most characters exist solely to praise Kirito, fall in love with him, or disappear from relevance the second the plot no longer needs them. The series introduces potentially interesting side characters and dynamics, then abandons them almost immediately. It's hard to care about the emotional stakes when the show itself barely cares enough to develop anyone. And the pacing is a disaster. The first arc feels like it's in a race to escape its own premise. What should have been a long-form survival story gets compressed into a highlight reel. Important moments don't land because the audience barely spends time with the world before the story jumps ahead again. It's like the writers were impatient with the only genuinely compelling idea they had. The worst part is that the show keeps acting like it's profound. It constantly gestures toward themes about identity, technology, isolation, and human connection, but rarely says anything meaningful about any of them. By the end, Sword Art Online feels less like a thoughtful sci-fi thriller and more like an aggressively awful power fantasy wearing the skin of a much smarter story. It didn't fail because the premise was weak. It failed because it had an incredible premise and squandered every opportunity that came with it. Sword Art Online is so bad that I genuinely think AI could write a better version. And honestly, that's not even meant as a compliment to AI. It's just an indictment of how badly this show fumbled its own concept. Think about it. You have a virtual death game where thousands of people are trapped inside an MMO, forced to survive or literally die trying. That premise should be impossible to mess up. You could turn it into a psychological thriller, a brutal survival drama, a commentary on online identity, or a deep exploration of human behavior under pressure. Instead, the show somehow devolves into discount wish fulfillment with paper-thin characters and pacing that feels like someone repeatedly hitting the skip button. So that got me thinking, if a machine trained on patterns and algorithms can produce something more coherent, more emotional, and more interesting than the actual writers did, what does that say about the original story? That's what we're testing today. I'm going to ask AI to rewrite Sword Art Online from the ground up. Same premise, same basic setup, but with better characters, better stakes, and an actual understanding of why the concept was exciting in the first place. No overpowered cardboard protagonist. No speedrunning through the most interesting parts of the story. No harem nonsense masquerading as character development. Just a serious attempt to make this idea live up to its potential. And by the end, we'll see whether a machine can actually outperform human creativity, or if the original story somehow manages to sink below AI-generated fan fiction. Instead of treating the death game like background decoration, we're going to sit inside it. We're going to explore what it would actually feel like for 10,000 people to realize they've been locked in a virtual world where every mistake could kill them.
One of the most frustrating things about Sword Art Online is that the fix was never complicated. The problem was never the premise. In fact, the premise is incredible. 10,000 players trapped inside a virtual reality MMO where death in the game means death in real life is the kind of concept most writers would kill for. That setup naturally creates tension, psychological horror, social conflict, survival drama, political power struggles, and existential questions about reality itself. The issue is that SAO barely explores any of that. It introduces one of the coolest ideas in anime history, and then immediately speedruns past it to focus on overpowered protagonist nonsense. So if I were rewriting Sword Art Online, the very first thing I'd do is slow the story down. The original series tears through floors like they're filler episodes, which is insane because the floors should be the story. Every floor should feel like a new stage in the evolution of this trapped society. Different environments, different economies, different factions, different cultures forming over time. One floor might become dominated by a military-style guild enforcing strict order. Another could turn into a lawless black market full of scammers and information brokers. Maybe one floor is populated mostly by players who've psychologically given up and decided to permanently live there instead of trying to escape. The point is that Aincrad should feel alive. It should feel like an actual civilization developing under extreme pressure. And that leads into the biggest wasted opportunity in the entire show: the psychological impact. SAO barely explores what this situation would actually do to people. Imagine being trapped for years inside a digital world where death is permanent. Some players would completely lose touch with reality. Teenagers would grow into adults inside the game. People would begin identifying more with their avatars than their real-world selves. Some would become terrified of leaving because Aincrad is the only life they remember anymore. You could even have children raised inside the game by trapped players. Suddenly, this isn't just an anime about gamers. It becomes a story about humanity adapting to an artificial world and slowly treating it as reality. Another major change would be making death matter again. In the original, death eventually just becomes background decoration. Characters die, everybody is sad for 30 seconds, and then the plot moves on. In a rewrite, every major death should permanently affect the story. Losing a frontline fighter should destabilize entire guilds. Boss raids should feel terrifying because one bad call could wipe out dozens of players. Information about enemy mechanics becomes priceless because knowledge literally determines survival. You want every major battle to feel less like a typical anime fight and more like a military operation where people genuinely might not come back. And of course, we need to talk about Kirito, because honestly, he's one of the biggest reasons the story collapses. He's not really a character so much as a walking power fantasy. He's automatically better than everyone, cooler than everyone, smarter than everyone, and every character in the universe eventually exists to admire him. That destroys tension because the audience never feels like he could actually fail. In a rewrite, the protagonist should just be one survivor among thousands. Skilled, yes, but flawed. Socially isolated in believable ways. Forced to rely on other people. Wrong sometimes. Maybe he hides the fact that he was a beta tester because other players resent beta testers for having prior knowledge while everyone else walked in blind. Now suddenly there's actual conflict and mistrust instead of the story treating him like anime Jesus. And then there's the game creator. The original completely fumbles this. After all the death and suffering, the explanation we get is basically, I forgot why I did it. That might genuinely be one of the worst villain motivations I've ever heard. In a better version, the creator should actually have a coherent philosophy. Maybe he believes virtual reality is humanity's inevitable future. Maybe SAO is a social experiment designed to prove that digital existence can become just as meaningful as physical reality. Over time, players form relationships, governments, economies, religions, and identities entirely inside a fake world. At that point, is it still fake? That's the kind of question the series should have been asking from the beginning. Because ultimately, the most interesting part of Sword Art Online was never the fights. It was the idea of an entire society trapped inside a game long enough for that game to stop feeling like a game. That's the version of SAO I would want to watch. Not a generic, overpowered protagonist fantasy, but a psychological survival drama about people slowly building a civilization inside a digital prison. And honestly, that's what makes the original series so disappointing. The potential was all there. The themes were all there. The setup practically begged for something ambitious. But instead of exploring any of it deeply, Sword Art Online constantly chose the safest, shallowest possible direction. It had one of the strongest concepts in anime history and somehow turned it into something terrible. Another thing I'd completely change is the structure of the story itself. The original Sword Art Online constantly feels like it's rushing to get somewhere else, as if the writers got bored of their own premise halfway through. In a rewrite, Aincrad would be the entire series. No random fairy arc, no gun game detour, no constant resetting into a new gimmick world every season. The death game is already strong enough to carry multiple seasons by itself if you actually explore it properly. Leaving Aincrad so early is like if Attack on Titan escaped the walls in episode 5 and never looked back. The setting is the appeal. I'd also make the game mechanics matter more. One of the coolest aspects of MMO stories is watching players exploit systems, discover hidden mechanics, form strategies, and adapt to changing metas. But SAO barely engages with its own world as a game. Skills appear whenever the plot needs them, overpowered abilities feel arbitrary, and the rules are inconsistent. In a better version, the mechanics should shape society itself. Certain guilds monopolize rare resources. Specific classes become economically valuable. Information brokers sell boss strategies for absurd prices. Frontline raiders become celebrities because they control access to progression. The audience should understand how this world functions because survival depends on understanding the system. I'd also massively reduce the amount of anime nonsense that undermines the tone. 1 minute SAO wants you to take the death game seriously, and the next minute it's doing awkward harem comedy or introducing another girl whose personality is basically likes Kirito. Completely destroys immersion. In a survival scenario this traumatic, relationships should feel messy, complicated, and emotionally grounded. Trust should take time. Betrayal should have consequences. People should act like human beings under pressure, not collectible waifu archetypes orbiting the protagonist. The villains would need a complete overhaul too. Most of the antagonists in SAO are cartoonishly one-dimensional. They're either psychopaths, creeps, or generic evil guys with no depth whatsoever. But in a setting like this, the best antagonists would be ideological. Some players would believe escaping is the only thing that matters, no matter how many people die along the way. Others would argue that the lower floors should stop sacrificing lives for the sake of reaching the top. Some might even believe Aincrad has become more meaningful than reality and should never be destroyed at all. Those kinds of conflicts are way more interesting because there's no easy answer. I'd also lean harder into the horror elements. People forget how horrifying the original setup actually is. Imagine logging into a game after school and suddenly realizing you may never see your family again. Imagine hearing thousands of people panic at once as they discover logout doesn't work. Imagine watching the first players die and realizing it's not a bug. SAO should feel traumatic. Not non-stop misery, but there should always be this underlying sense of dread hanging over the world. Every victory comes with exhaustion. Every floor cleared costs lives. Every player understands they're one mistake away from disappearing forever. And honestly, I'd make the ending way more uncomfortable. In the original, escaping mostly feels like a clean, happy ending. But realistically, surviving SAO would permanently ruin people psychologically. Some survivors would struggle to reconnect with reality. Some would miss Aincrad because that world became more real to them than their actual lives. Some relationships formed in the game would fall apart outside of it. Others might become stronger because they survived something no one else could understand. The ending shouldn't just ask, did they escape? It should ask whether returning to reality even feels like returning home anymore. That's the version of Sword Art Online that actually lives up to its premise. Not a shallow power fantasy with MMO aesthetics, but a long-form psychological survival story about humanity adapting to life inside a digital world. The original had all the pieces for something incredible. It just never had the patience or ambition to fully explore them. One of the biggest failures of Sword Art Online is that it barely feels like an actual MMO. It looks like one aesthetically, but the game design itself makes almost no sense once you think about it for more than 5 minutes. And that's a huge problem because if the world is supposed to trap people for years, the game itself needs to feel believable enough that people could genuinely build lives around it. So in a rewrite, the MMO design would be one of the most important parts of the story. The game mechanics shouldn't just exist for fight scenes, They should shape the economy, politics, culture, and psychology of the entire world. First, I'd make Aincrad feel less like a generic fantasy RPG and more like a living online ecosystem. Every floor would have its own biome, resource economy, crafting specialties, and social dynamics. Lower floors become overcrowded because weaker players are too afraid to advance. Middle floors become trade hubs where merchants and guilds compete for influence. The upper floors become incredibly dangerous territories controlled almost entirely by elite raiding groups. Over time, players naturally create class divisions based on progression. The economy would matter a lot more too. In most MMOs, money barely matters because the protagonist is always rich somehow. But in SAO, currency should determine survival. Food, housing, armor repairs, weapon crafting, information, transportation, everything costs resources. That means entire professions emerge naturally. Some players become blacksmiths because frontline guilds desperately need high-quality gear. Others become traders, scouts, chefs, smugglers, or information brokers. Not everybody becomes a fighter because realistically, most people wouldn't survive that lifestyle. The game world starts resembling an actual society instead of just a combat arena. I'd also redesign combat to feel more tactical and dangerous. In the original, fights eventually become flashy anime sword beams where Kirito wins because he's built different. In a better version, combat should feel closer to raid coordination in real MMOs. Tanks manage aggro. Support classes track cooldowns. Scouts gather boss data. Entire raid groups practice mechanics before attempting encounters because failure means real death. Bosses become infamous disasters that players discuss for months. Clearing a floor should feel like a historical event, not just another episode climax. Another thing I'd fix is the skill system. In SAO, unique skills like dual blades basically exist to make Kirito special, which is terrible design both narratively and mechanically. Instead, skills should emerge from player behavior and experimentation. Maybe obscure builds become viable because certain players dedicate months to mastering them. Maybe hidden mechanics are discovered organically by the community. Players should constantly test the limits of the system because that's exactly what MMO communities do in real life. I'd also make information one of the most valuable resources in the game. Imagine how important knowledge becomes when death is permanent. Knowing a boss mechanic could save hundreds of lives. Knowing where rare materials spawn could shift entire economies. Some guilds would hoard information for power while others freely distribute guides to help humanity survive. Suddenly, MMO strategy becomes political. The metagame itself creates conflict. The social systems would matter too. Guilds wouldn't just be groups of cool fighters. They'd become governments, corporations, religions, and military organizations all at once. Some guilds would exploit weaker players. Others would genuinely try to protect people. Rivalries form over resources, territory, and ideology. Smaller communities develop identities tied to specific floors. Over time, players stop acting like gamers and start acting like citizens of Aincrad. And honestly, I'd lean way harder into the idea that people slowly optimize the fun out of the game, because that's what MMO communities actually do. Early on, players explore and experiment. But as survival becomes more desperate, efficiency starts replacing adventure. Meta builds dominat. Safe grinding routes get standardized. Guilds demand strict optimization. Frontline raiders become trapped in exhausting schedules because humanity's progress depends on them. The game stops feeling magical and starts feeling like labor. That shift would perfectly reinforce the psychological themes of the story. That's the version of SAO where the MMO part actually matters. The game shouldn't just be a backdrop for anime fights. It should function like a believable online world that thousands of people are forced to live inside for years. Every mechanic, system, and design choice should influence how society evolves. Because once people are trapped there long enough, the game itself effectively becomes reality. Another place Sword Art Online completely drops the ball is its mythology. And I use that term loosely because in the original series, mythology isn't really a system or a structure. It's just decoration. Bosses get cool-sounding names, skills are labeled with fantasy references, and the story occasionally gestures at lore without ever committing to what any of it actually means. It's aesthetic world building, not functional world building. In a better version, mythology in Aincrad wouldn't be decoration at all. It would be something alive, evolving, and deeply tied to how people survive inside the game. First, there would be no single, fixed interpretation of what Aincrad is. Instead, competing mythologies would emerge naturally from the player base. Some players would believe the world is a divine trial, a kind of purgatory designed to judge human worth. Others would insist it's a corporate experiment that went wrong. Others would think it's an evolving AI learning from human behavior. None of these would ever be confirmed or denied, and that uncertainty would become part of the psychological pressure of the world. People don't just survive the game, they survive not knowing what the game even means. And that's where mythology stops being background flavor and starts becoming survival infrastructure. Because in this version, players use mythology to make sense of danger. Bosses wouldn't just be random fantasy monsters with flashy names. They would become recognized archetypes that players gradually learn to interpret. Certain floors might consistently produce guardian-type bosses, defensive entities that punish aggression and reward patience. Others might produce echo-type bosses that mimic player strategies or adapt mid-fight. Over time, players start building frameworks to predict behavior based on patterns, and those frameworks become mythological language. It's not just lore. It's tactical understanding disguised as storytelling. Even naming becomes important. Early players don't fully understand what they're facing, so they name bosses based on appearance and behavior, sometimes inconsistently, sometimes emotionally. But those names stick. They spread through guilds and forums and become accepted truth. That's how mythology actually forms in real online communities, through repetition, fear, and shared experience. In a better SAO, that process isn't accidental. It's the foundation of how the world is understood. Then there's the darker side, mythology as manipulation. In a death game, information is power, and mythology is just information shaped by belief. Certain guilds would deliberately spread false lore to control other players. If you can convince rival groups that a boss has a mechanic it doesn't actually have, you can manipulate their strategy, drain their resources, or send them into failure. Myths become propaganda, and propaganda becomes lethal. Suddenly, controlling belief is just as important as controlling weapons or territory. And then we go one layer deeper, the game itself starts contributing to the mythology. The system would subtly reinforce patterns that feel symbolic over time. Bosses might reflect recurring behavioral themes: fear, greed, isolation, cooperation, desperation. Not in a literal "this boss represents sadness" way, but in ways that only become obvious after multiple encounters across different floors. Players start noticing echoes, repetitions, and structural similarities that feel intentional. That creates a growing paranoia that Aincrad isn't just a static dungeon tower. It might be reacting to them, adapting to them, or shaping itself around their behavior. At that point, mythology stops being storytelling and starts becoming existential interpretation. So instead of random references to Norse gods or fantasy aesthetics, you get a living system where mythology is constantly being built in real time. Players create myths to survive uncertainty. Guilds weaponize those myths for control. The game reinforces patterns that make those myths feel real. And nobody can fully separate what is lore, what is strategy, and what is just collective belief forming under pressure. By the time players reach the higher floors, Aincrad isn't just a dungeon anymore. It's a shared mythology everyone is trapped inside, constantly being rewritten by fear, experience, and survival itself. And that's the key difference. In the original Sword Art Online, mythology is something the show borrows. In a better version, mythology is something the players create, weaponize, and eventually become trapped inside. Fight scenes in Sword Art Online are where the cracks in the whole system become impossible to ignore. In the original Sword Art Online, fights often stop feeling like survival encounters and start feeling like choreographed anime showcases. The tension drains out because outcomes are either over-explained, over-stylized, or just decided by protagonist momentum. The stakes are technically death is permanent, but the fights rarely feel like that actually matters in the moment. So in a rewrite, the first big change is this: fights stop being about spectacle and start being about information, coordination, and risk management. Combat in Aincrad should feel closer to a high-stakes raid in a real MMO than a stylized sword duel anime. That means most fights aren't one-on-one hero moments. They are group operations. Players need scouts to gather data on boss behavior, tanks to control positioning, support players to manage buffs and healing items, and damage dealers who only engage when conditions are safe. A single mistake doesn't just hurt the protagonist, it can collapse an entire strategy. That immediately changes the tone. Every fight becomes a logistical problem before it becomes an action sequence. Instead of flashy, I win because I'm special moments. Victories come from preparation and adaptation. Bosses aren't static enemies with predictable anime patterns. They evolve mid-fight, punish repetition, and force players to adjust on the fly. A strategy that worked on one floor might be completely useless on the next. That makes every encounter feel like discovery rather than repetition. And importantly, no fight should ever feel safe. Even when players are experienced, there should always be uncertainty. Limited information, incomplete maps, hidden mechanics, environmental hazards, resource depletion. All of these should contribute to the feeling that every encounter could go wrong at any moment. You don't grind bosses. You survive them. Another major fix is removing the idea that one character can dominate combat through sheer uniqueness. In the original, Kirito often feels like he is operating under different rules than everyone else. That breaks the internal logic of the world. In a better version, skill matters, but it is distributed across teams. No one person should be able to consistently override group failure. If a raid succeeds, it is because the group functioned correctly, not because one overpowered player saved the day. That also means deaths actually matter during fights. Not in a dramatic, slow-motion sacrifice speech way every time, but in a cold, structural way. Losing a single support player might reduce healing capacity enough that the entire raid becomes unstable. Losing a scout might mean the group loses critical knowledge about the next phase of a boss fight. Death isn't just emotional, it's mechanical collapse. I'd also remove the tendency for fights to escalate into pure spectacle. No sudden energy beams. No unexplained power spikes. No hidden legendary skill unlocks that appear exactly when the plot needs them. Instead, combat progression should come from mastery of systems. Players improve by learning timing, positioning, resource efficiency, and coordination, not by unlocking narrative exceptions. And then there's pacing inside fights themselves. A lot of SAO battles feel like they jump from phase to phase without meaningful downtime or decision-making. In a better version, fights should have rhythm. Planning phases, execution phases, panic phases, recovery phases. Moments where players regroup mid-battle, reassign roles, adjust strategy, or even abort the encounter entirely if the risk becomes too high. Retreat should be a real option, not a narrative impossibility. Visually, the fights would also feel different in tone even if animated similarly. Instead of clean, heroic duels, you'd see messy coordination, overlapping callouts, miscommunication, and near failures constantly being corrected. At the last second, the tension doesn't come from flashy animation, it comes from watching systems barely hold together under pressure. And maybe the most important change is this: fights are not the point of the story. They are the consequence of the world the characters are trapped in. Every encounter exists because resources are limited, territory matters, information is incomplete, and survival depends on taking calculated risks. So when a raid succeeds, it doesn't feel like a victory over a monster. It feels like a temporary stabilization of a collapsing society. That's the difference. In the original Sword Art Online, fights are highlights. In a better version, fights are crises. The compression problem in Sword Art Online is one of those issues that quietly breaks everything else, even when individual scenes are fine. On the surface, it looks like a pacing issue, but it's actually deeper than that. It's a failure to represent time as a lived experience. In a story where people are trapped for years, time should be the main antagonist. Instead, it's treated like background data. We're told that months or years pass, but we almost never feel that passage in how the world changes, how people change, or how systems evolve. It creates this weird illusion where the characters are aging, but the narrative behaves like it's still early in the same week. That's what I mean by compression. Major events in SAO are stacked so tightly together that they feel like they happen in rapid sequence rather than over lived years of psychological pressure. Entire floor progressions, guild shifts, economic changes, deaths, betrayals, and societal restructuring all get condensed into short arcs with very little breathing room in between. As a result, nothing has time to settle. The world never stabilizes long enough for consequences to actually accumulate. And that has a cascading effect on everything else. If time doesn't feel real, then character development doesn't feel earned. Relationships form and resolve too quickly. Trauma doesn't linger long enough to shape behavior in meaningful ways. Political structures don't evolve slowly through pressure and compromise. They appear, serve a plot function, and disappear. Even victories don't feel like long-term turning points, because there's no space afterward for the world to react to them. In a properly paced version, clearing a floor wouldn't just be an episode climax. It would be a historical rupture. The aftermath should matter as much as the event itself. Prices shift. Guilds fracture. New leaders emerge. Supply lines stabilize or collapse. People relocate. Some players retire from frontline combat entirely, due to exhaustion or grief. That kind of slow aftermath is what makes a world feel real. But SAO often skips that entirely. It jumps from crisis to crisis without letting the ecosystem of the world breathe in between. Another symptom of compression is how it destroys emotional continuity. In real long-term survival scenarios, grief doesn't reset. Fear doesn't reset. Trust doesn't reset. But compressed storytelling constantly forces emotional resets, so the next arc can function independently. That makes characters feel strangely static despite everything they've supposedly endured. It's like the story is erasing its own history every time it needs to move forward. There's also the issue of psychological aging being flattened. If someone spends years in a life or death environment, they don't just become stronger or more serious. Their entire personality structure changes. Their risk tolerance changes. Their attachment style changes. Their sense of identity changes. But because SAO compresses time narratively, characters often behave like they've had intense experiences without actually showing the long-term deformation those experiences should cause. And this is the part that really breaks immersion. The world never feels like it reaches equilibrium. Even in a death game, societies stabilize in cycles. Economies stabilize. Power structures stabilize. Fear becomes routine. New norms emerge. But SAO rarely lets those stable states exist long enough to matter before introducing a new disruption. So instead of a living system adapting over time, you get a sequence of crises that feel disconnected from one another. A better version would treat time like pressure that accumulates slowly but permanently. Early game chaos should look nothing like mid-game society, and mid-game society should look nothing like late-game civilization. Not just in scale, but in psychology. The world should become more structured, more rigid, more politically complex, not just stronger. Players and higher floors. And importantly, the audience should feel the weight between meaningful changes. Not in a boring way, but in a way that makes progress feel weighty. Clearing a floor shouldn't just be next episode content. It should feel like something that takes months of preparation, failure, recovery, and adaptation both in-world and in narrative focus. Right now, SAO compresses time to keep momentum. But in doing so, it accidentally removes the very thing that would make its story powerful. The slow, irreversible transformation of people and society under prolonged stress. Another major problem in Sword Art Online is how it handles stakes. And on paper, this should be the easiest thing in the world to get right. The premise already does most of the heavy lifting. If you die in the game, you die in real life. That is a permanently extreme condition. But the issue is that the story doesn't actually use that condition in a nuanced way. It just repeats it, over and over. Every arc becomes, this is life or death. This is extremely urgent. This is the most important thing ever. Until the idea of danger starts to lose its meaning. And that's the core issue, stakes fatigue. When everything is treated as maximum intensity all the time, nothing feels comparatively more important. The story keeps presenting new crises at the same emotional volume, so the audience stops feeling escalation. It becomes noise, not because the stakes are low, but because they are never allowed to vary. There's no contrast, no pacing, no sense that some problems are local while others are systemic. It's just constant urgency without structure. A better version would fix this by making stakes multi-layered instead of flat. Not everything should be about immediate death. Some arcs should be about survival in the literal sense, boss fights, raids, and life-or-death encounters. But others should be about slower, structural risks. Guilds collapsing, food shortages, information monopolies, or entire floors becoming politically unstable. There should also be psychological stakes that don't resolve quickly, like long-term trauma, loss of trust, or players becoming unable to function in combat due to fear or burnout. That variety is what keeps danger feeling real instead of repetitive. The second big fix is persistence. In SAO, consequences often feel strangely self-contained. A major event happens, it gets resolved, and then the story moves on without fully showing how that event permanently changes the world. But in a system like this, nothing should reset cleanly. If a guild loses experienced raiders, that should permanently affect future boss attempts. If misinformation spreads and causes failed strategies, that should reshape how future players approach combat. If an economy is disrupted by resource loss, that should change how people survive on lower floors. Stakes only matter when the world remembers them. Another issue is how centralized the stakes become around the protagonist. Even when the world is supposedly collapsing, the narrative often narrows focus to whatever Kirito is currently doing, which makes the larger crisis feel smaller than it actually is. In a better version, the death game should feel like it's happening everywhere at once. While one group is fighting a boss, another is dealing with political unrest, and another is struggling with resource scarcity. Survival shouldn't feel like a single storyline, it should feel like a distributed system of crises happening in parallel. And then there's emotional inflation. SAO often escalates emotions very quickly, introducing tragedy, romance, betrayal, or sacrifice at full intensity without enough buildup or enough aftermath. That creates short spikes of impact, but they fade quickly because there's no long-term emotional structure holding them in place. In a better version, emotional stakes would build slowly and linger. A single death could influence guild politics for entire arcs. A betrayal could permanently change how players approach cooperation. Emotional consequences should stretch across time, not reset after the next narrative milestone. Ultimately, stakes shouldn't just be about how dangerous something is in the moment. They should be about how far that danger reaches, how long it lasts, and how deeply it reshapes the world afterward. Right now, Sword Art Online treats stakes like a constant emergency broadcast. Always urgent, always maximal, always the same volume. A better version treats stakes like a living system, layered, variable, and persistent, where meaning comes not from shouting, "This is serious," but from showing how every choice permanently changes the world people are trying to survive in. Another thing Sword Art Online never really solves is its player count. On paper, 10,000 players sounds like a lot. It gives the situation weight. It makes the world feel populated. But when you actually look at how Sword Art Online uses that number, it creates a strange kind of mismatch between what the story is implying and what it actually shows. Because 10,000 people is big enough to sound like a collapsing society, but small enough that you can't actually depict it in full detail. So the result is this awkward middle ground where the world feels too large to fully focus on, but too small to feel like a truly systemic civilization simulation. Most of those players effectively disappear into the background, which makes the 10,000 trapped lives premise feel more like atmosphere than reality. And that becomes a bigger problem the more serious the story tries to be. If you're only following a small cast, then 10,000 is essentially invisible. You don't feel the weight of that population. You feel a handful of guilds and recurring characters. But if the story wants you to believe this is a full-scale MMO society collapsing under its own pressure, then 10,000 starts to feel almost too small to support the level of complexity being implied. You get the sense that there should be larger systems, deeper hierarchies, and more visible societal fragmentation, but the story never fully commits to portraying them. So the number ends up exposed as what it really is, a narrative convenience rather than a functional system. A better version would solve this by making a clear design choice instead of sitting in the middle. One option is to keep 10,000 players but fully embrace the idea that Aincrad is a small, dense, high-stakes survival society. In that version, everyone important is connected through overlapping guilds, economies, and reputations. Death is globally significant because the population is small enough that every loss meaningfully shifts power structures. The world feels tight, interconnected, and constantly under pressure. Another option is to increase the scale significantly. If you really want Aincrad to feel like a full MMO civilization, then 10,000 might actually be too low. A larger population would allow for deeper stratification, more independent cultures across floors, larger guild politics that feel like nations, and true anonymity in lower tiers of the population. But that comes with its own cost. The story would need to shift away from individual focus and lean much harder into systemic storytelling. There's also a third, more interesting approach. Keep the number at 10,000, but stop treating it as a single unified group. Instead, divide it into layers of participation. A small core of frontline raiders pushing progression. A mid-tier group of semi-active players maintaining stability. And a large population of lower-floor survivors who have effectively stopped participating in the main game entirely. Suddenly, Aincrad doesn't feel like one story. It feels like multiple overlapping societies existing under the same conditions. That kind of structure would make the world feel much more realistic, because that's how large groups of people actually behave under long-term pressure. They fragment, they specialize, they stop sharing the same goals. And that's the core issue with how Sword Art Online handles its population. The number itself isn't the problem. The problem is that it's never fully used as a system that shapes behavior, economy, or storytelling scale. Right now, the series treats 10,000 players as a background fact. In a better version, it would treat them as the entire foundation of the world. One of the most consistent weaknesses in Sword Art Online is how it handles its female characters. In Sword Art Online, they often don't feel like fully realized people with independent goals. Instead, they tend to orbit the protagonist, serve short-term emotional functions, or get introduced as if they're going to matter long-term and then gradually fade into background relevance once their narrative purpose is complete. And the core issue isn't just bad writing, it's structural. The story is built in a way that doesn't give most characters, especially female ones, enough independent narrative space to exist outside of their relationship to Kirito. So even when individual characters start strong, the system of the story pulls them back into orbit around a single central figure. In a better version, the first major fix is simple. Female characters need independent narrative gravity. They shouldn't be introduced as extensions of the protagonist's journey. They should arrive with their own goals, their own survival strategies, and their own role in the evolving Aincrad society. That means when a character is introduced, the question isn't, how do they relate to Kirito? The question is, what part of the world are they trying to survive or control? For example, instead of a character existing primarily as a companion or romantic interest, she might be a guild strategist managing logistics for a mid-tier survival faction. Or a black market information broker controlling boss data distribution. Or a frontline raid leader who has no interest in the protagonist's perspective at all, because her priority is maintaining stability for hundreds of players under her command. The key is that she has authority, responsibility, and consequences that exist independently of the main character. Another major improvement is consistency. In SAO, female characters often start with strong setups, competent fighters, leaders, survivors, but over time, many of them get softened into emotional support roles. A better version would resist that regression. If a character is introduced as capable and autonomous, she stays that way. Growth doesn't mean becoming closer to the protagonist. It means evolving within her own trajectory. Romance also needs to be treated differently. Instead of being a default outcome or narrative reward, it should emerge slowly from shared survival pressure and mutual trust. It should not replace a character's identity or goals. In a world as unstable as Aincrad, relationships would be fragile, conditional, and often secondary to survival obligations. That makes any emotional connection more meaningful, not less. Another key fix is diversity of perspective. Right now, many female characters in SAO are written through similar emotional lenses: supportive, empathetic, or romantically focused. A better version would deliberately diversify their roles and philosophies. Some characters would be pragmatic and morally rigid. Others would be politically ambitious. Others would reject cooperation entirely and build isolated survival systems. Some might even develop ideological opposition to the idea of escaping Aincrad at all. The point is to avoid treating female character as a shared narrative function. And importantly, agency has to be real, not decorative. That means female characters should make decisions that meaningfully affect the world even when the protagonist is not involved. Guilds rise and fall based on their choices. Economies shift because of their strategies. Other players respond to them as leaders, rivals, or threats, not as supporting cast. In a properly restructured version of Sword Art Online, no character, male or female, should feel like they exist primarily to validate the protagonist's journey. But the female cast is where this issue becomes most visible, because the original story repeatedly funnels them into emotional dependency arcs or narrative sidelining once their initial role is complete. So the real fix isn't just write better women. It's remove the structural gravity that forces any character into orbit around a single center. Once you do that, the female characters stop feeling like variations of the same supporting role and start feeling like what they should have been from the beginning. Independent survivors in a collapsing digital world, each trying to impose their own meaning on a system that was never designed to care about them at all. Floor bosses and loot in Sword Art Online are another area where Sword Art Online looks like it has depth on the surface, but collapses the moment you try to treat it like a real system instead of a scripted set piece. In the original, floor bosses are basically episodic raid encounters with predefined patterns, cinematic introductions, and loot that conveniently appears when the plot needs a reward. They function more like final episodes than part of a living game ecosystem. And loot drops are even worse. They're treated as narrative prizes rather than economic forces. Rare items exist to make protagonists or key characters feel special, not to shape the wider world. In a rewrite, both bosses and loot have to stop being storytelling props and start behaving like systems that shape civilization inside Aincrad. Floor bosses, first of all, should not feel like handcrafted anime encounters. They should feel like emergent Apex systems inside a living MMO ecology. That means they have consistency but not predictability. Each boss is tied to the identity of its floor, its environment, its resource structure, and its dominant survival conditions. A forest floor doesn't just have a forest boss. It produces a class of boss behavior shaped by terrain control, ambush mechanics, and resource denial. A ruined urban floor produces entirely different dynamics: replication, adaptation, territorial memory. Over time, players start realizing something important. Bosses aren't just obstacles. They are systemic expressions of the floor itself. That changes how raids are approached. You're not just preparing to fight a monster, you're trying to understand the logic of an environment that is actively hostile to you. And crucially, bosses should not exist as isolated one-and-done events. Their presence should ripple outward. Failed raids leave behind destabilized zones. Successful raids don't just unlock the next floor, they alter migration patterns, economic access, and territorial control. On the current one, a cleared boss changes society, not just progression. Now loot is where SAO really wastes its best opportunity. In a real MMO survival economy, loot is not decoration. Loot is infrastructure. In a better version, drops are not just rare swords or armor with stat boosts. They are the backbone of civilization inside the game. Materials, crafting components, durability modifiers, rare consumables, information fragments, map access keys. These are what actually matter. A single drop could stabilize a guild's entire economy or collapse it if monopolized. That means loot becomes political. Guilds don't just compete for boss kills, they compete for distribution rights. Who gets access to rare crafting materials determines who becomes the arms supplier. Who controls healing consumables determines who survives long-term raids. Who holds mobility items or teleport-related resources effectively controls movement across floors. Suddenly, loot isn't personal reward, it's geopolitical leverage. And unlike the original, loot should not be evenly distributed or conveniently heroic. There should be conflict inside victory. Even after a boss is defeated, the question becomes, who gets what? That creates tension that persists after combat ends, which is exactly what SAO usually avoids but desperately needs. There's also room for something the original barely explores: information loot. Some of the most valuable drops shouldn't be items at all, but knowledge, boss mechanics, hidden floor properties, crafting discoveries, or system anomalies. In a death game, knowing something others don't is as powerful as any weapon. That turns exploration and documentation into survival roles in their own right. And finally, bosses and loot should reinforce the most important idea of the rewrite. Aincrad is not a series of levels to clear. It is a collapsing ecosystem that reacts to human behavior. Bosses are not just checkpoints. They are pressure events that reshape society. Loot is not reward. It is power distribution. And together, they form the economic and political engine of the world. In that version, every raid isn't just an episode climax. It's a restructuring of civilization inside the game. One of the biggest structural mistakes in Sword Art Online is where it ends. In Sword Art Online, stopping the Aincrad storyline at floor 75 doesn't just feel abrupt. It feels like the story gives up on its own premise partway through. Because if the entire concept is a 100-floor death game, then ending at 75 is essentially cutting off the final act of the story. It's like building toward a climax for dozens of hours and then skipping the conclusion because the narrative wants to move on to something else. The result is that the most important psychological and societal transformation, the part where the world either fully collapses or fully adapts, never actually happens on screen. In a rewrite, Aincrad has to go all the way to floor 100. Not because completing the number feels satisfying, but because the final quarter of the tower is where the entire meaning of the story actually pays off. The lower floors are about survival. The middle floors are about adaptation. But the upper floors, especially 75 to 100, are where society inside Aincrad stops being reactive and starts becoming structured. By this point, players are no longer just trying to survive the game. They are living inside it. Guilds have become political entities. Economies are stable but fragile. Information is controlled. Territory matters more than individual skill. The world has already stopped being a game in any meaningful sense. So the final stretch should reflect that shift. From floor 75 onward, progression should slow down dramatically. Not in a frustrating grind sense, but in a narrative sense. Every floor becomes a major historical event. Clearing a floor is no longer just defeating a boss. It's reshaping the entire power structure of Aincrad. Entire alliances rise and fall based on raid outcomes. Resource access becomes increasingly unequal. The gap between frontline guilds and lower floor populations becomes politically explosive. By the time players reach the 90s, the story should feel less like a dungeon crawl and more like a collapsing civilization approaching its end state. Some groups would be fully committed to finishing the game. Others would begin resisting completion entirely, because Aincrad has become their only functioning society. That ideological split becomes one of the central conflicts of the final arc. And then floor 100 itself shouldn't just be the final boss fight. It should be the culmination of everything the system has been building toward. The final boss is not just a combat challenge. It is a confrontation with the structure of the world itself, the logic that created Aincrad, and the accumulated consequences of every decision made by the players inside it. But just as important as the final boss is what comes after it. Because ending the story at floor 100 also forces the narrative to deal with the aftermath properly. In SAO's original structure, the world effectively resets once the game is cleared, and the most interesting part, the long-term psychological and societal consequences, gets compressed or sidelined. A full 100-floor structure allows the ending to actually breathe. It gives space to show what happens when a society that has spent years inside a digital survival system is suddenly forced to confront reality again. And that's where the real ending lies. Not in the final sword swing, but in what it means for every system built inside Aincrad to suddenly stop having purpose. So in a better version of Sword Art Online, floor 100 isn't just a number. It's the narrative obligation the original story never fulfilled, the point where survival, society, mythology, and identity all finally collide, and the world inside the game has to face the fact that it was never temporary for the people living in it. One of the most undercutting choices in Sword Art Online is how death ultimately works. In Sword Art Online, we're told early on that the rules are absolute. If you die in the game, you die in real life. That rule is the foundation of the entire premise. It's what gives the world its weight, its fear, and its urgency. But then, quietly, the story starts bending that rule when it becomes inconvenient. Characters like Kirito and Asuna effectively die inside the game world, and then continue on in ways that blur or weaken the finality of that core mechanic. And the problem isn't just continuity, it's what that does to the entire emotional structure of the story. Because once death stops being fully final, the entire system of tension starts to unravel. In a rewrite, that rule has to be untouchable. If the premise is built on permanent death, then that permanence cannot be negotiable, reversible, or selectively ignored for emotional convenience. Otherwise, every future moment of danger becomes less meaningful in hindsight. The audience stops fully believing in consequences, even if the story continues to insist that consequences matter. So the first and most important fix is simple. Death must stay death. Always. No exceptions. That means if a character dies inside Aincrad, they are gone from the narrative in every sense that matters.
No hidden survival loopholes.
No secret exceptions for main characters. No narrative saves that bring them back because the story needs them later. The moment you introduce even one exception, you weaken the entire foundation of the world. And this is especially important for main characters, because the real cost of high-stakes storytelling isn't just that side characters can die. It's that anyone can die, including the people the audience is most attached to. That is what makes the world feel unstable and real. If the protagonist is exempt from that rule, even implicitly, then the danger becomes conditional instead of absolute. In a stronger version of Sword Art Online, the emotional weight comes from knowing that no narrative importance guarantees survival. Not skill, not popularity, not proximity to the protagonist. If a character is in a raid, in a duel, or in the wrong place at the wrong time, they can be permanently removed from the story. And that removal has to be final, not softened or reversed later. That also changes how relationships function. When death is truly permanent, every interaction gains long-term weight. Alliances are not just strategic, they are existential. Trust becomes risk. Friendship becomes vulnerability. Romance becomes something that carries the constant possibility of irreversible loss. That doesn't make the story more cynical, but it does make it more honest to its premise. It also forces the narrative to commit to consequences instead of resetting them. In the original structure of Sword Art Online, the emotional impact of death is often undercut by the story continuing forward with minimal structural change. But in a version where death is fully permanent and consistently respected, every major loss reshapes the world. Guilds don't just feel sad, they collapse or reorganize. Economies shift. Raid strategies change permanently. Certain floors become remembered as turning points in the war for survival. And most importantly, the audience never gets the comfort of reversal. Because once you allow even a single technically they survived exception in a system built on permanent death, you don't just save a character, you erase the certainty that gives every other moment its meaning. So the fix isn't complicated, but it is strict. Death in Aincrad has to mean exactly what it says, every time for every character without exception. Not as a shock tactic, but as a consistent rule that the story itself is not allowed to break. Because in a world built on survival, the most important rule isn't how you win fights. It's that losses are permanent, and the world has to keep going anyway. As you can see, those are just a few ways Sword Art Online could have been dramatically better without needing any miracle-level rewriting talent or secret industry insight.
No reinventing storytelling. No genius auteur intervention.
Just basic consistency, consequences that actually persist, and a willingness to treat the premise like it matters for more than 5 minutes at a time. And here's the uncomfortable part. All of it was written completely by AI. Not a team of veteran anime writers. Not a studio brainstorming room. Not some mythical creative genius who finally cracked the code on how to fix one of the most famously squandered high-concept premises in modern anime. Just a language model following a pretty straightforward idea. What if this story actually committed to what it sets up? Which is kind of the point. Because when an AI can take a concept like SAOs and immediately start patching structural issues like pacing, stakes, MMO systems, character design, mythology, and narrative consequences without running out of obvious improvements, it raises a funny question about how much of the original problem was actually hard to write versus how much was just not being fully thought through. This isn't about pretending AI is some kind of creative replacement for humans. It's about how low the bar sometimes feels when a premise this strong gets executed in a way that constantly backs away from its own potential. A death game inside a fully realized MMO world with real psychological and societal consequences shouldn't require advanced storytelling theory to make compelling. It mostly just requires consistency and patience, two things the original series seems to treat like optional DLC. So when people say AI could probably write a better version, it's not really a flex for AI. It's a side eye at the gap between what Sword Art Online could have been and what it actually committed to being. And honestly, the most impressive thing here isn't that AI wrote these fixes. It's that they even needed to be written at all. It really just proves that Sword Art Online is so poorly written, you don't even need a genius writer, a veteran novelist, or some legendary anime director to improve it. Apparently, all it takes is a machine with a checklist. Does the world make sense? Do consequences matter? Does the story actually commit to its own premise? And suddenly you've got a noticeably better version sitting there. And that's kind of the uncomfortable punchline. Not that AI is secretly a storytelling mastermind. It's not. It's that the original structure leaves so many obvious gaps that simply not ignoring them already looks like improvement. You don't have to reinvent narrative theory. You don't have to unlock some hidden layer of creativity. You just have to stop treating the most interesting parts of the premise like optional background decoration. Because once you do that, once you actually commit to the death game concept, the MMO systems, the societal collapse, the passage of time, and the psychological consequences, suddenly the story starts looking a lot more coherent. Not because anything revolutionary was added, but because the original idea was finally allowed to exist without being constantly diluted or interrupted. And that's where the irony kicks in. You've got a high-concept setup that should be doing heavy narrative lifting on its own, and yet it consistently under-delivers to the point where a machine can generate a cleaner, more structured version just by following basic logic. No emotion el intuition. No lived experience. Just, if people are trapped in a death game MMO for years, maybe the world should actually behave like that. Which is why the critique lands the way it does. It's not really saying AI is better than humans at writing. It's saying the bar for improvement is so straightforward in this case that even a purely mechanical approach can step over it without breaking a sweat. And that's the real jab at Sword Art Online. Not that it's irredeemable, but that its biggest problems are so structurally obvious that fixing them feels less like creative brilliance and more like just finishing the job the story itself started and then wandered away from. When you look at everything we've laid out for Sword Art Online, the MMO systems, the permanent consequences, the full 100 floor structure, the player-driven economy, the mythology, the boss design, the character rewrites, it starts to become pretty clear that none of this is really about adding complexity. It's about consistency. It's about taking the original premise seriously enough that it's allowed to fully exist without constantly being softened, skipped over, or reset when it becomes inconvenient. Because that's the real pattern with SAO. It introduces an incredible idea, leans into it just long enough to hook you, and then backs away before it has to deal with what that idea actually implies at scale. So every fix we've talked about is really just one shared goal in different forms. Stop interrupting the consequences of the story. So if I had to distill how I would fix Sword Art Online into its core approach, it would come down to a few fundamental commitments. First, Aincrad has to be the entire story. Not a starting arc, not a prologue, not something we leave behind once the real plot begins. The tower is the narrative. Every floor matters not just as a checkpoint, but as a shift in how the entire world functions. Time has to pass in a way that actually reshapes people, societies, and systems, not just their levels and gear, but their psychology and their sense of identity. Second, the MMO has to stop being aesthetic and start being structural. That means treating it like a real ecosystem that players are trapped inside. Guilds become governments. Loot becomes infrastructure. Information becomes power. Bosses aren't just cinematic encounters. They're events that reshape economies and territories. Survival isn't just about being strong in combat, it's about understanding how the world actually works well enough to exist inside it long term. And third, the story has to fully commit to permanence. If death is a rule, it has to be an absolute one. No exceptions, no narrative loopholes, no selective reversals when it becomes emotionally inconvenient. Because the second you break that rule even once, you don't just undo a character, you weaken every future moment that depends on that rule being real. The same applies to consequences in general. Decisions should stick. Losses should reshape the world. Time should leave marks that don't reset when the plot moves on. Once you lock those three things in: full commitment to the setting, real systemic MMO logic, and uncompromising consequences, almost everything else stops being a separate fix and starts becoming a natural outcome of the design. Characters become more grounded because they exist inside systems that don't revolve around them. Stakes feel more varied because danger operates on multiple layers instead of a single repeated formula. Even emotional moments become stronger because they're no longer isolated spikes. They're part of a world that keeps moving afterward. So when I look at all of these changes together, I don't really see a collection of rewrites. I see what Sword Art Online could have been if it had just done one thing consistently from the beginning: trust its own premise enough to never back away from it. And honestly, that's the real fix. Not inventing something new, but refusing to stop halfway through something already great. A lot of people like to draw this dramatic line in the sand when it comes to AI, like it's some kind of existential threat to storytelling itself. The assumption is always that human-made automatically means better, more meaningful, more artistic. But then you look at something like Sword Art Online and that argument starts to feel a lot less airtight. Because if the choice is between a genuinely well-structured, coherent story generated by AI or a heavily inconsistent, premise-rich but execution-light narrative that constantly backs away from its own best ideas, then yeah, people are going to have questions about that human superiority claim. And to be clear, this isn't about pretending AI is some kind of artistic genius. It isn't. It doesn't understand stories the way people do. What it does very well, though, is follow structure. It doesn't forget its own rules halfway through. It doesn't get bored of its premise. It doesn't suddenly decide that the most interesting part of the story is optional and should be rushed through so we can get to a romance subplot instead. Meanwhile, a lot of the frustration with SAO comes from the fact that it has exactly the kind of high-concept setup that should be incredibly hard to mess up: trap players, permanent death, MMO society collapse, and still manages to underuse it in ways that feel almost deliberate in their avoidance of depth. It's not that the ideas aren't there. It's that they're constantly being stepped over. So when someone says, "I'd take AI writing over that any day," the actual point isn't AI is better than humans. It's more like, if a machine can be prompted to stay consistent with the premise and deliver a more coherent version of events, what exactly was stopping the human version from doing the same thing? And that's where the snark really lives. Because at that point, it stops being a debate about AI creativity and starts feeling like a much simpler question. Why does a system optimized for pattern following sometimes end up producing something that feels more structurally committed than a human-written story that keeps drifting away from its own foundation? And if that question stings a little, it's probably because it's not really about AI at all. It's about how low the bar can feel when a story with this much potential manages to consistently step just to the side of it instead of over it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than people think. It tells the algorithm this wasn't a complete waste of everyone's time, and it pushes the video out to more people who will either agree, disagree, or angrily comment about how wrong everything is, which is basically the entire ecosystem working as intended. And if you didn't enjoy it, well, you've still made it this far, so either you're curious, stubborn, or just waiting for the point where I finally say something that gets me canceled. Either way, you're already here, so you might as well stick around for the next one. Either I'll make a better video, or I'll keep dissecting fictional worlds like it's a full-time job. Honestly, at this point, both are equally likely.